Hello, I am Scott Roth, your instructor. Name of this video lecture, Truman defeats Dewey and Wallace and Thurmond. So this will focus on the 1948 presidential election in which there are four candidates. Truman, of course, Dewey, Strom Thurmond, and Henry Wallace. Wallace was almost made vice president by Roosevelt in '36. There were some clashes between the two, and it is important to recognize or to differentiate, I guess, Henry Wallace, an extreme progressive, from George Wallace, who was not progressive. And when we get to 1968, we will discuss him more in depth. Now, some context is in order here, as it always is when trying to understand history. Franklin Roosevelt, of course, was the previous president. He had been elected 4 times. He followed 3 Republicans who were president in the 1920s. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, who probably deserves more credit and recognition for his presidency, and Herbert Hoover, who was undone by the Great Crash and the Depression. Now, Hoover did take some actions, but his biggest mistake was he stuck to his ideology rather than recognizing that he needed to be a pragmatist, that there are some situations where you have to eschew ideology and just do what's right at that time. In many ways, Roosevelt's programs didn't really fix everything, and they did very little to fix the bigger problems of the Depression. But Roosevelt took action, and he reached out to the American people, and he made them feel good about themselves again. And this is so important, I think, when you look at the New Deal and Roosevelt's success. But this was something that Hoover did not do. He thought people should figure it out kind of on their own. He was very much about individualism. He was very much a traditional conservative. So with that context behind us, I want to get to the Democratic Convention that was held in Philadelphia. This is where we see significant change, not just relating to this campaign and this election, but to an overall transformation of the Democratic Party that will create really it's one of its main themes that we still see today in theory. Now, Truman, when we get to the convention, in theory, he is not very popular. Why? He followed Roosevelt. Roosevelt was insanely popular. But even as his choice of vice president by Roosevelt was somewhat interesting, questionable, many kind of were curious why Roosevelt made the decision he did, because he was no FDR, and Truman was no Eisenhower either. Now, Eisenhower, of course, would run in '52 and '56 as a Republican. How conservative he was, who knows? But the Democrats did try to recruit Eisenhower to run as a Democrat in '48. He refused to do so. Now, Truman was an uneducated, small-town Missourian, and many questioned whether he could even win the presidency for the Democrats. Now, contrast that to Roosevelt, who is a highly educated, Eastern liberal. And here you have Truman, who's kind of this, middler, small-town guy, not educated. He was kind of antithetical to Roosevelt, but he had many strengths, which we're going to get to. But before we get to those, the divisions within the Democratic Party. World War II, of course, comes to an end. The Democrats are still in power. Truman, of course, takes over for Roosevelt after he passes, and he is not president for very long when he has to make a rather big decision regarding using the bombs to end the war. But after the war, you have the same kind of general issues that you see that pop up there. How do you, transition the economy? How do you bring that back? How do you give people jobs back that were fighting overseas? And then you take the jobs away from those who are working here, et cetera, et cetera. There are many issues, and Truman kind of navigates these. But the Democratic Party as a whole, there is considerable division. One area that we see is the Popular Front, which was rather sympathetic to socialist ideas and called for greater government action and increased reforms. And this side of the party also differed regarding the Cold War. Now, Henry Wallace was the head of this progressive faction. He was fired as Secretary of Commerce by Truman because of a speech he gave in which he declared the United States should stay out of Eastern Europe, that it was no more their business than Latin America was Russia's. Now, in the big picture, when you look at Wallace, you could consider him somewhat of an appeaser. He wanted to kind of give in to the Soviets. He wanted to make peace pretty much at any cost. He wanted to avoid war. Kind of makes sense. But he was not His ideas really did not define the Democratic Party. Again, he is somewhat on the left of things. Truman and others represented a more middling group of Democrats. Now, a second group that creates division is the Southern Democrats. They are trying to hold on to the past. Truman had already shown he was more than willing to tackle civil rights issues more than previous presidents. This is one area in which Roosevelt failed in the New Deal, though in the big picture one may be able to understand he's trying to fix larger problems with solutions that could theoretically trickle down or be shared by minorities. But he was worried about the entire nation. He could not afford to focus on one group. And of course, we know Roosevelt was no racist, no matter what anybody says. And Eleanor did more, his wife, of course, did more for civil rights than anyone up to that point. And in no way am I minimizing Eleanor as an other. She was an amazing individual and thinker on her own. But Roosevelt was no racist. He did not tackle civil rights. This was a big issue, and this very much divided the Democratic Party because you have these Southerners who, of course, have supported secession 100 years earlier, but they supported segregation and limited voting rights, et cetera, et cetera. And there is an argument over the Democratic Party platform. The big conundrum, of course, is African Americans be an important part of the Democratic constituency. They could be. But so were Southern whites. Now, previously, Democrats had only given lip service to civil rights and party platforms, but the new ADA, or Americans for Democratic Action, called on Truman and the Democratic Party to specifically call for new legislation. Their 4 specific points were an abolition of poll taxes in federal elections, thereby opening up the vote, anti-lynching legislation, Ida Wells, big part of her past, a permanent Fair Employment Practices Committee, and desegregation of the armed forces. Truman's very much on board with many of these things. Not all Democrats are. Again, politics is ugly. And so you have to make sure that the Southern Democrats are happy, but you also want to give voice to a new rising potential constituency. This is where we see a sea change in the Democratic Party that will affect it again permanently, in theory. Hubert Humphrey, who was then the mayor of Minneapolis and a candidate for Senate, and of course we know he will later serve as Lyndon Johnson's vice president, and he will run for president in 1968 himself. But Humphrey gave an emotional speech which culminated with what would be his most famous quote: "The time is now arrived in America for the Democratic Party to get out of the shadow of states' rights and walk forthrightly into the bright sunshine of human rights." Whoosh. This is significant. This is gutsy. It articulates this quite well. And it would lead the party to vote very narrowly regarding the party platform to incorporate those civil rights issues. Humphrey was very much a man ahead of his time. His vice presidency, of course, somewhat belabored because of Johnson. But the speech he gives in 1948 is huge. And it has to be recognized as one of the pivotal points, really, in our history in the 20th century. So the liberals win a close vote regarding the party platform. The entire Mississippi delegation and most of the Alabama contingent walk out of the convention. Other southern states refused to support Truman. They put forth their own candidate, Richard Russell of Georgia. 2 weeks after the convention, Truman issued an executive order mandating equal opportunity in armed forces and in federal civil service. Again, Truman was a man of action, and he had taken civil rights actions even before the convention. But this, again, only solidified his beliefs, and he went further. This outraged Southern secessionists, who nominated Strom Thurmond as their presidential candidate for their states' rights party, the Dixiecrats. Now, when we get to the presidential election, it serves as a landmark in American politics, a representation of a changing tide of identity politics and the political parties associated with different groups. Up through the 1960s, the South voted Democrat. It was known as the Solid South. But this would begin to change in 1948 with the Dixiecrat Revolt and Truman's stand for civil rights on the Democratic Party platform. This change again would mark a new wave, a new age for the Democratic Party that again, in theory, lasts through today. Initially, we see some change with the New Deal coalition put forth by Roosevelt for the New Deal. This is when, again, we see African Americans come to the fold. and strengthen their voice as Democratic voters. The New Deal coalition of voters is also a significant factor that we see develop under Roosevelt. Farmers, women, African Americans, unions, etc. These are some of the groups that will comprise that. And again, they remain a major part of the Democratic voting constituency. So in the 48 presidential election, we have 4 legitimate candidates. We have Henry Wallace's Progressive Party, we have Strom Thurmond's Dixiecrats, Thomas Dewey's Republicans, and Harry Truman's Democrats. Now, Dewey. Let's talk a little bit about Dewey, the popular New York governor who had made many positive reforms. Now, Dewey is no slouch. He is a gang-busting special prosecutor and district attorney. He had been governor of New York for 6 years, during which time he had cleared out the slums, extended clinics and hospitals, cleaned up mental institutions, outlawed racial discrimination in the workplace, added to the state's infrastructure, and cut state tax rates by 50%. And of course, he was anti-communist, which is absolutely important in 1948. But it's important to note that Dewey was also a moderate. He and Truman were similar on many issues. Both promoted civil rights, both promoted fair housing programs, both promoted expansion of Social Security, for example. The two did not attack each other, of course. Politics was much more civilized back then because they were not that different also. And with regard to policy, they were quite similar. In personal makeup, there was a stark contrast. Truman was the small-town Midwesterner who spoke to common Americans on their own level and had very little background as a prominent or powerful senator or vice president. He was not a career politician. Dewey, on the other hand, was a New Yorker. He was polished. He had a long, distinguished record. Now, Truman's folksy style won people over. He made further inroads by beginning to take questions off the cuff when he gave his whistle-stop tour. For example, and again, he takes questions without a teleprompter, off the cuff, and it'd be interesting to see certain politicians try that today. But his whistle-stop tour brings out the masses with one of his famous quotes, "If you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen." Notably, that summer before the election, he made the Republican Congress a scapegoat. Now, Republicans dominated in Congress at the time. But he called them into session in the summer. This was called the Turnip Day, or Turnip Day is when he initiated this, and so that's what's called kind of the Turnip Day sessions. But they tore down and denied many of his proposals, some of which were supported by Dewey. For example, Social Security, housing reform. This showed the division within the Republican Party. So he called them do-nothings. People started to yell, "Give 'em hell, Harry," and he replied, "I never give anybody hell, I just tell the truth, and they think it's hell." Now, again, when we look at the Republicans here, you've got a Republican Congress which is much more conservative than Dewey. You've got Dewey, the candidate, who's more moderate. And this conservative Congress denies Truman's goals here, which, of course, different political parties. But again, by doing that, they're also providing a sense of criticism of Dewey and kind of refuting his ideas. So there's a lot of complexity here when we look at how all this comes together. Now, let's talk a little bit about the Dewey defeats Truman headline. Why was it so wrong? And I would say, was it wrong? Was it really that dominant? Now, obviously, there's not good polling at this time, some outdated methods to garner votes. Newsweek magazine predicted a landslide for Dewey because simply they interviewed 50 leading political writers and none of them voted for Truman. I mean, we see this today, right? We see a media that is very much on the side of one party and trying to push one party. That's what the media was doing then too. They wanted Dewey. They didn't want Truman. And so they focus on those people who support Dewey. Now, when Truman was told about these 50 political writers, he said, quote, it's one of my favorite quotes, I shouldn't mess it up. "I know every one of these 50 fellows. There isn't one of them who has enough sense to pound sand in a rat hole." Classic Truman, right? Small town guy. Much of the public polling was done in areas where Truman simply did not have a great deal of support. If you focus on big cities, for example, Dewey's obviously going to take that vote. But what are small towns? What are the Midwest? Often left out of these types of polling. And polling has improved in theory, but we have seen in past elections how it's still not as scientific as they may want it to be. For example, 2016, nobody thought Trump was going to win, but he won. Which gets to another issue, and that is the politics of polling. The media likes to push certain candidates for whatever reason, does not always tell the whole story. Truman connected with the American people in a way that the media and coastal elites simply did not understand. And that's what this whistle stop tour did. It brought him to the people. He connected with them. He was one of them. Now, another reason why maybe it wasn't such a surprise, again, Dewey is more progressive than many Republicans and many Republican congressmen who were in office at the time. There's a schism between the two, as Taft and others in Congress were much more conservative. Dewey ran on civil rights, for example, which was not a priority for either party really up until this time, until that 1948 convention. Thus, a good number of Republicans were not 100% behind Dewey and his platform. They did not gush with support thusly. Throw in the fact that Truman's approval rating was quite low, again, polling, and the press predicting a Dewey landslide. There's also a sense of overconfidence among Republicans. And this will lead people to not vote, right? If you think your guy or woman is going to win the election without a problem, and everybody's telling you, oh, he or she's going to win, no problem, you may not be that excited to go vote. You may take the day off, right? And consider how divided the Democratic Party was at this time, yet Republicans did not take advantage of this, losing a significant opportunity to put an end to the 2-decade run of Democratic presidencies. Another reason, after 16 years of one party, the press and many others, again, were pushing for change, regardless of how the population felt. It seemed inevitable to change hands. The presidency would change hands at this time with the accidental candidate in Truman the only thing standing in the way. Many had grown tired of the New Deal. Elites, many people around the country, they had grown tired of activism and change, of the party of Roosevelt, and assumed everyone else agreed. In fact, when we look at Truman's presidency, which I discuss in the video lecture, The Buck Stops Here, he was unable to achieve many of the reforms he sought. Why? Partially because of a Republican-led Congress that generally wanted to move away from New Deal activism, and some American voters were, again, kind of tired of all the activism, all the change. They sought a return to the normalcy, which we see after many wars. Another reason, the economy was in good shape. And it's about the economy, stupid, right? Isn't that the old quote? But people were in general enjoying abundance and all of its accoutrements. Industry was booming, allowing for jobs and good pay. Consumerism rose to allow people to buy the goods that they truly wanted. Unlike the previous 2 decades of depression and war, they were now actually able to buy things, and they could and did buy things. The quality of life for most Americans was high. It was only improving. Health rates, mortality rates, increased life expectancy. In short, America and Americans were doing well. For most American voters, the economy is first and foremost when it comes to election, and this is what affects families directly more than anything. What are you worried about? The price of butter and eggs, or are you worried about some somewhat vague legislation that probably won't affect you at all? Again, these are the nuts and bolts issues that people worried about. For Truman, another reason, he's the incumbent. Never underestimate the power of being an incumbent. One can look at almost any election at any level. Americans often complain about their politicians, and yet we continue to re-elect them over and over. Joe Biden, for example, worked in D.C. from the early 1970s until 2024. There are other people in Congress who have been there since 1980 or even earlier. This is not what the founders envisioned. They did not see people being in office for 30 or 40 years. Again, life expectancy plays a part in that. But it is what, again, Americans have facilitated. We re-elect people over and over. The incumbent always has that advantage on his or her side. And this is something that Truman certainly enjoyed. One final reason why I think that this is not really that big of a surprise, Truman's appeal. Again, he's one of us. Truman was sincere. He was a commoner. Read, he was not an elite. He worked hard throughout his life. He spoke the language of the common citizen. This resonated with the bulk of voters. Now, I've shared a few of the quotes. People love those. Again, that showed that he was one of us. He's not some elite who we have no access to. He's a guy who comes and talks to us and speaks in our language. So it's not really a shock that Truman was so popular with the American people. Now, There is some irony here that I will point out in the larger context of presidential contests, and this is kind of the beginning of when we see the end of this rural versus urban divide. It actually switches up for the most part here. Truman was a ruralite. Again, he grew up small town Missouri. He was arguably more conservative than the Republican nominee. He defeated the Republican who had the backing of the two biggest states in the country, California and New York, and many urban areas. But Truman, as a Democrat, again, will take this rural vote. As we move forward, this is going to begin to change. And for the most part, Democratic presidential candidates are those from bigger cities, and their strength is in the big cities and in the bigger states. Whereas conservatives, Republicans will, again, garner more support in rural areas in general. So, what are the final numbers? Again, was this really that big of an upset? Truman took 303 electoral votes. Dewey took 189. Strom Thurmond and the Dixiecrats took 39, which is rather amazing. They were only on the ballot in 16 states, and they took 4 of those states, obviously all in the Deep South. But it is curious knowing how much support they had even in such a limited area. But Truman, again, wins the presidency. Dewey becomes somewhat of a footnote in history, and Truman's next 4 years as president will be rather active before he retires and before he gives way to, again, Dwight Eisenhower.